Welcome to our discussion of voting behavior and election reform. Here are the things that we're going to look at today. What are patterns in voter turnout? Why can turnout be so low? What are ways to improve turnout? What are patterns in voter choice? And what are reforms that can be made to the election process? So let's get started with patterns in voter turnout. So here's what voter turnout is. It is the proportion of the voting age public that votes. And in some elections in the United States, that's 40%. 40% of the eligible adult population of the United States votes regularly. Why? Why is that number so low? Well, one of the factors that comes into play is education. Voters are usually more highly educated than non-voters. Educated know more about politics. They're less hindered by the requirements. Income is also another factor that influences voter turnout. Incomes over $40,000 vote more regularly than below $10,000. The wealthy think that the system works for them and that their vote makes a difference. Is there an opportunity cost of voting that's too high for the poor? And a feeling of alienation amongst lower income populations, that the system isn't working for them? Also, age is a factor in voter turnout. The 26th Amendment lowered the voting age to 18, but the young are still not very likely to vote. They're the least likely to vote. In fact, less than one-half of all eligible 18 to 24-year-olds are even registered. The ages of 30 to 70 are the most likely to vote. Another factor that influences turnout is interest in politics. Experiences at young ages play a huge role in shaping how people view politics. For those who are interested in working for campaigns, winning and losing do not necessarily dampen people's interest in politics, but not much of the U.S. population is actually interested in politics. There are some estimates that place that number around 5 to 10%. Now, race and ethnicity also make up a big factor that influences turnout. Whites tend to vote more regularly than blacks. Especially in the South, this pattern is very pronounced, which is lower turnout than the rest of the country. Southern states made it extremely difficult for blacks to register to vote after Reconstruction. The Voting Rights Act of 1965 was passed 100 years after the Civil War amendments, which hoped to address this. It's the most successful piece of civil rights legislation ever passed. It gave the federal government the ability to monitor voting regulations in areas that had traditionally been prone to discrimination. And Hispanics represent a huge and growing voting bloc. Hispanics do not vote in great numbers, even less than the black vote. So why is turnout so low? Sometimes below 50%, even for presidential elections. The most common response that people give is that they're too busy. 1/4 of non-voters said that they were too busy. But perhaps that's just an easy excuse. One other factor could be the difficulty of registration. A vast majority of people who are registered to vote do vote. So the people that aren't voting are the ones that are not registering. They're eligible, but they're not registering. A relatively low number of adult population is registered to vote. In the United States, the burden of registration is on the individual and the initiative that that individual has. Most countries place the burden of registration on the government. So perhaps the cost to register is higher in the United States than in other countries. Studies do show that relaxed registration laws lead to higher turnout. And one idea that has been tried to try to fix this are motor voter laws, where you register to vote through the DMV. States with the law have a higher turnout compared to other states. Another factor about registration could be the difficulty of absentee voting. In some places, the requirements are a little bit absurd, where somebody would have to show up in person to register to vote absentee, which if you're showing up in person, that kind of defeats the purpose of absentee voting. Perhaps there are too many elections in the United States. But that's the result of federalism and the separation of power, where you have different branches that are accountable to the people. So the people have to share their opinion. So what are ways to improve turnout? Maybe easier registration and absentee voting laws? The laws vary by state. Don't forget the states are the ones that get to control voting. Maybe being able to register to vote closer to election day when interest spikes, when people do get more interested in the election, rather than cutting off registration periods before the election happens. Maybe you automatically get registered when you're 18. Perhaps you could make election day a holiday, which would remove the too busy excuse. For absentee voting, let's see, another thing that we could do is to reduce the number of elections. Change the election day to a weekend when people tend to have more time. Use proportional representation, not just the winner-take-all system, to encourage third-party participation so people have more parties to choose from. And here's what we mean by that. So currently, most states use this winner-take-all system, which awards the office to the highest vote getter without ensuring representation for voters in the minority. So if a candidate wins 51% of the vote, they win the office, but the candidate that got 49% came so close to winning gets nothing. So that means a slim majority of voters can control 100% of elected offices. One idea could be a shift to proportional representation, where citizens don't necessarily vote for the candidate, the individual, but vote for the party. And nationally, the party that wins a certain proportion of votes would then get that proportion of seats in the legislature. And we've used a couple terms in describing these. A majority is made up of half the votes plus one. So that's the 50.01%. A plurality, and this is what a lot of elections in the United States are based off, is a plurality. It's just the most votes. Doesn't necessarily mean a majority. And usually if there's three candidates in an election, the candidate with the plurality will win. I mean, they'll win with less than 50% of the vote. And Duverger's law is a law that says in states and countries that use the winner-take-all and have the single-member districts, like the United States does, that means that there's going to be a two-party system. And under Duverger's law, proportional representation results in a multi-party system. So maybe having more political parties would get people more excited about political participation. Does low voter turnout matter? Would results be different if more people voted? Some people say no. Why should voting be easier for people who are lazy or apathetic? And low turnout makes the system more stable. Those are the common arguments that those who think that the low turnout is okay make, but it turns out that all three of those arguments are wrong. They're just not true. When women were arguing for suffrage, the argument that the husband represented the wife didn't pass muster then. So voters do not represent non-voters. Non-voters tend to be young, low-income, blue-collar, less educated, and minority. So the people who are voting don't represent non-voters. So it would change results potentially. So what are patterns in vote choice? So by race and ethnicity, whites vote Republican and blacks vote Democrat. That is a pattern that has emerged from data on voting. 88% of blacks voted for Kerry in 2004, 11% for Bush. Hispanics are also overwhelmingly Democrat, with the exception being Cuban Americans around Miami. The Asian population is less monolithic. The Chinese Americans tend to be Democrat, Vietnamese tend to be Republican. Typically, Asians favor Democrats 60-40. Gender, women are much more likely to support the Democrats and men Republicans, the gender gap is around 5 to 7%. We defined gender gap in a previous discussion, just the difference in how women and men vote. Women make up a huge electorate, so capturing that female vote is crucial. For income, the poor tend to vote Democrat. Ideology, liberals who favor government involvement vote Democrat. Typically, conservatives who favor less government vote Republican. So in terms of patterns in vote choice, one thing that's been happening a little more frequently would be deserting party affiliations, and that's seen in ticket splitting, where voters would vote for candidates of different parties for various offices in an election, like a president of one party and then voting for that individual's House member of a different party. It's the opposite of a straight ticket. It's more common for independents to do this, although blacks tend to be the most common straight ticket voters. Maybe an increase in ticket splitting is a sign that voters don't trust either of the parties to govern. And ticket splitting is more common in a divided government. A divided government is when the presidency is held by one party and one or both houses in the legislative branch is controlled by the other. Maybe there are some reforms that can be made to the electoral process to increase turnout or to get people more excited about voting. But most proposals focus on the Electoral College, which would be very difficult to change because that would require a constitutional amendment. And for the timing in presidential primaries, one idea is to have a regional primary. An example would be the Yankee primary in New England. So the country would be divided into 5 or 6 regions, and all states in that region would have the presidential primary on the same day. So there would be some rational order in the electoral process, and that would end the permanent campaign of the presidential primary season. Now candidates are going to Iowa and New Hampshire so early, whereas if there was a regional primary, then perhaps that would be eliminated. Okay, that takes us to the end. Hope it helped, and good luck studying.